I'm Amanda Franks. I'm the president of the Market Economics Society here at Charleston. This is our second night of Market Economics Week. We have more events coming up later in the week. We have a flyer outside. You can save one when you leave, or if you haven't already gotten it. So tonight we're having Zachary Slayback from Praxis. He's the business development director and co-founder. He is an entrepreneur that has worked in nonprofit, in the education sector, and in the for-profit. He was a research fellow at UPenn in moral psychology, and he worked at the Institute for Humane Studies, and now he's here speaking to us on how entrepreneurs can change the world.
Hi, everyone. So, there's kind of a lofty title, a lofty question behind the title. So, the question is essentially, how do we change the world? At one point, I think most people, if you've ever been devoted to a cause that you feel strongly about, you've asked yourself this. You want the world to be a better place. It might be in many different forms. If you are into business, that might be launching a product that you think is going to change the world. If you're someone who's motivated by the ideas of what a market society and a market economy looks like, you might be looking to make the world a freer place, make it more economically liberal, a place where people can exchange with fewer boundaries in between them. If you're someone who is into a variety of activities that usually young people tend to get into, you've asked yourself this question. So there's a question before that, and that's, why are you there to start with? And I think that there's a variety of ways that people get into, especially the ideas behind like market economics, but they might get into it because they read something that they felt passionately about. They might get into it because they took a political quiz and it told them, oh, well, this is the way that I believe that the world ought to work, and the way that I think that it's going to go if it's something that I pursue. They might get into it because they heard somebody talking about it and just decided to go Google it. And I think for a lot of people, regardless of your political views, but for a lot of people when it comes to the issue of social change and what people feel very, very passionately about, a great example in recent times is actually, up there the gift, Ron Paul. That people get excited when they hear about things, people who are motivated to change the world, either move towards either a freer economy or one of their ideals in the world. But, and as you look around, we live in a time of great progress, right? You think about what your iPhone looked like 10 years ago versus what your iPhone looks like now. You think of what the cell phone was like 20, 30 years ago, what the cell phone is like now. You look at just the way that laws have changed in a variety of realms in the last couple of decades. People have been made freer, been made better off in a variety of ways over the past 2 or 3 decades alone. I saw a great article today. It was an editorial from the New York Times. Everyone loves to think pessimistically, especially when they're thinking about innovation and progress, and especially market progress. It was an editorial from 1985 about the laptop. It was about how this is a niche product, it's never going to catch on, no one wants to have a keyboard at their fingertips. Why would anybody do that? No one's going to go to the beach or sit on the train while they could be, sit on the train on their laptop when they could be reading the business section of the newspaper, or flipping through the latest issue of Sports Illustrated. And that was 1985. And then, I mean, I was thinking about this, I was reading it on my iPhone with a little keyboard at the very bottom, about how I would go nuts if I don't have that little keyboard in front of me. So the world does change, and the people who change it come in a variety of flavors. The people who are motivated to change it are motivated by a variety of things. But when you really look at the way that things have moved in a variety of ways, again, either politically, socially, economically in the past couple of decades, things have gotten really cool and a lot better in a couple ways, but there's another way that it can be put, that things could be a lot better than they actually are. Think of the science fiction writing of the 1960s. Think of the Jetsons, right? Of these television shows from like the mid-20th century, and when they took place in their shows, or like these movies from like the 1970s, like in the near future, the year is 2001. And like there are humans on Mars and things like that. They're able to, they have flying cars and robot dogs. So progress is pretty cool. You look at the things that go into your cell phone, you look at the ways that Social change has come about in the last couple decades. It's come across in some really interesting ways that people wouldn't have anticipated, but it's not quite what we've been looking for. And I think that when you're motivated by social change, it can mean a variety of things. Like I said, I like, because it's incredibly photogenic and just the weirdest, oddest ways. I like using Ron Paul. But it could come in a variety of ways. But really what people want when they're talking about social change is, well, if you Google social change, essentially everything that comes up is either like communist propaganda or unicorns and butterflies. So I decided to use unicorns and butterflies. What you want is you want the world to be a better place, right? You want the world to progress in a way that reflects your values, reflects what you think a better place means. And for different people, that means different things, even different people who hold similar values. So there's a couple common approaches to social change, and a couple of those that are really, really popular. You may actually hear about some of them, one of them in particular, from other speakers throughout Market Economics Week. Is it Market Economics Week? Yeah. So, instituting that social change can come in a variety of ways. And one of the most popular ways, especially among people who make it their jobs to institute social change. You know, if you work for, there's an office, there's a company in my office, a couple doors down, that does corporate recruiting, and their name is like Global Pundits. It's like Global Generic Corporation Name Incorporated Continental. But if you work for like a generic corporate job like that, you're probably not primarily motivated and thinking every single day about, okay, what do I need to do to institute this change? What do I need to do to make the world reflect my values? And there are some people who are, and I think many academics are. I think many people who work at think tanks are. I think many people who work at organizations like the Institute for Humane Studies are. And there's a variety of ways that we can bring about this social change. I've never used an iPad to do a presentation before, so I'm sorry about any of the up and down between slides. But there's a variety of ways we can do it. It's unicorns anyway. One of the most popular ones, and one of the ones that I actually find quite convincing, is this sort of pyramid of social change, right? You think about all the great social change movements throughout history, and they usually reflect this in a couple of ways. Now, okay, it's a pyramid with some poorly drawn lines on it. What does that actually mean? Well, you look through the pyramid, and there are different movers and shakers who move social change along. At the very, very top, you have the people who actually inspire movements. You have the people who provide the ideas. They provide the intellectual ammunition which drive people to, write 1,000-page books on a specific topic, to devote their lives to something. These intellectuals can come in a variety of flavors. Some examples are, Friedrich Hayek, Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus Christ, Karl Marx, Ayn Rand, Ludwig von Mises. These are people who have written about ideas, written about what a better society looks like, written or talked about them, and that movements crop up following them. Next, you have kind of like secondhand dealers, or think tanks in the modern sense. These are people who devote their lives in their jobs and their careers to getting these ideas out there among society, members of society. And then actuators, who they might hear about the ideas, they might think about them, but then, okay, I've learned why X policy is inefficient and helps stymie progress towards, a freer society, or stymies progress towards my idea of utopia, but now I need people to understand it so that they can get out there and they can vote. These are your actuators. And you have media, who help do the same thing. And then at the very, very bottom, you have the voting public, and below them, politicians. So, a lot of people like to think, this actually goes against the very popular narrative that you tend to be fed, especially through 9th grade civics, that you want to change the world, you need to run for president. You need to run for Congress. Become a senator, then you can change the world. So, I'd like you to imagine that you want to become a senator, and you live in, it's like Nebraska. It's a state of nowhere. You live in Nebraska. I actually really like Nebraska. You live in Nebraska, and you believe that policies that reflect a free world, reflect a free economy, are the ones that create the best kind of world. So you're going to be opposed to a variety of policies, corporate handouts, sort of regulations that make it harder for young and up-and-coming entrepreneurs to join a marketplace. and also farm subsidies. So you want to reflect your values in how you vote politically. So you go to Washington, you give this nice, great stump speech, like Mr. Smith goes to Washington, and you vote against corn subsidies and farm subsidies. Next election cycle comes around, and you get a deluge of angry constituents telling you about how you don't care about their families, you don't care about the schools, you didn't even ever vote on the schools, you don't care about all the things in their community, you essentially hate grandma and American pie, and apple pie, and all the things that come with it. Freudian slip, we can go into that moral psychology. So, why is that? Well, that's because the reality is reflected in the pyramid, right? The public ultimately determines where politicians move. Politicians aren't movers and shakers. They're the people who follow essentially wherever the carrot's put in front of them. The carrot can mean anything. It can mean one of the greatest examples actually is, since we're here in Charleston, you can think of politicians in Seattle. Politicians in Seattle tend to be very, very pro-union, because if they ever move against unions, even if they might personally be very against unions, but if they ever vote against them, they're out in an instant like that. Similarly, you're going to see, if you haven't already, similar movements in the disposition of politicians here in South Carolina. They're going to ultimately move towards a position where they oppose unions more and more, because you have concentrated interests, you have special interests that get concentrated benefits and disperse the costs of this among many people in society. This idea of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, take the idea of the farmer and with corn subsidies. You're a corporate farmer, you get $1 billion a year in farm subsidies. It makes sense for you economically. It's economically rational for you to spend $999,999.99 to lobby against getting rid of corn subsidies, because you will still come out ahead then. So for all the people in your constituency who, they're opposed to corn subsidies, let's say you have 100,000 constituents, they're not each going to give up, hundreds of dollars of their time to go lobby against it. Meanwhile, for you, it makes plenty of sense. So there's a couple ways that we can approach the pyramid. And one of the ones that is often the favorite of people is, one of the ways, like I said, is politicians, but there are some issues with politicians. One of those being bandwidth.
Looking wife and a newborn baby that I've dressed in a suit to prove to you that I mean business. For the last 15 years, I've lived my life in such a bland, uncontroversial, and repressed manner that it's almost unnatural. Why? Because I've been preparing to be a representative since I was a child. Most well-adjusted, sane men would be hesitant to take a job where their decisions would so drastically affect the lives of so many. But not me. I possess a sort of sociopathic narcissism that makes me think that I should be in charge of everyone. But all of that needs to start here at home, in this beautiful state that I've grown to love since I moved here 18 months ago. Together, we can piggyback some of our state's legitimate needs onto my unquenchable lust for self-glorification. And that's a promise. Here's an unflattering picture of my opponent. Here's a quote of his taken out of context. Oh, and one more thing. I have a dog. I enlisted in the military for the minimum amount of time in a position that would never see combat. Why? Well, because it would help me be your senator. I don't make friends. I make acquaintances. All of my motives are ulterior. I'm self-involved to the point of psychosis. My soul is terrifying. And that's leadership. So this November, let's send Washington a message. And what is that message? Hey, me.
Obviously, this is a bit of a parody, just a bit, from what his kids you know. But it gets to the point, right? That your political leaders, many of them, I'm sure that they're wonderful people who don't necessarily possess sociopathic narcissism. But they're primarily self-motivated, right? Just like you and I are. When we study economics, we use this idea of economic actors as being rational utility maximizers, homo economicus. But somehow, especially when we're in, like, again, 9th grade civics, when we start talking about political leaders, they lose this idea of being rational utility maximizers. They suddenly become self-interested because they've entered into the political realm, or the public realm, which is the nicer way of saying it. But in reality, that's not the case. They, like you and I, are rational utility maximizers. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just going to throw a bit of a curveball into the traditional conception of social change that we come to accept. So, okay, politicians are out. What about working with think tanks? There's a lot of cool think tanks out there that do really neat economic research, really neat legal research, really even neat like moral and philosophical research. And they do provide some good to the world. But when was the last time you thought of a major policy change? A major policy change, I'm sure there are smaller ones, but a major policy change that when people were interviewed about it on the street, why they voted for a certain politician on this key issue, they said, well, you know, I read this great white paper from the Cato Institute, or from the Brookings Institution, or something like that. No, it plays its role, but what we're looking for is how can we change the world? How can we move to the closest idea of being that person from whom ideas just kind of come out and into society are actually brought about? Well, you know, being a junior policy analyst at, again, like the American Enterprise Institute isn't going to be quite as close. Okay, so we can move the pyramid further. Where else on the pyramid can we go? Pyramid up. Okay, there we go. Okay, figured it out. Okay, well, you can throw money at the pyramid. You can decide that, okay, maybe I'm not the best at bringing about these ideas. Maybe if I become a politician, it's not actually going to do anything for myself. I'll make a ton of money and then I'll just start lobbying, and things will start going my way then. There are a variety of issues with this. If you're not familiar with who these two people are, it's Charleston, David Koch, and I just put them on there because if you go to like slaverssalon.com, you'll read that they like eat babies for breakfast and things like that. They're usually very public figures for political donations, though. So political donations are one way that you can move the pyramid. But again, you're going to run into a lot of these problems further down the pyramid, right? Or further up the pyramid. You're going to run into the fact that a lot of these research institutions aren't necessarily the most efficient. Becoming this like prime mover intellectual at the very top of the pyramid is really, really hard. There's maybe like a couple hundred people ever throughout history who you could argue are up there. And that's being really generous. I would say there's probably less than 100. So there's some inefficiencies with this idea as well. So what's the next thing? We have to start asking ourselves if we're asking the wrong question. This question thus far turns on this idea that we need more people to believe X. If my idea of a better world is making more people vote in a certain manner or believe for a certain thing, then I need to follow that schema that I had up there. And that schema doesn't necessarily have to keep itself to the political realm, right? You can move on, you can move into the religious realm, you can move into the social justice realm, you can move into the economic realm just as well. You might not have politicians at the bottom, but you might have the voting public or the public in general. But all of these ideas thus far turn on this idea that we need more people to believe X before Y can happen. That we need just more people to believe something. And I think that might be us asking the wrong question. There's a short answer to this, and the short answer is no. I don't think we need more people to explicitly believe X. Like, if you go poll somebody, you believe like that policy A or belief A is the best way for the world to go forward, and you need more people to go out there and believe A if you polled them on the streets. Is that necessarily the way that you get the world to change? And I think the short answer to that is no. Okay? Why? What's the long answer? Okay? Action obviously matters. And beliefs matter as well. Well, beliefs inform actions, right? And this doesn't contradict anything I've said earlier. If what we need to bring about X or Y society is more people to believe X or Y, this kind of makes sense. But maybe beliefs break down in a way that we weren't thinking about earlier. Maybe we do more than simply believe what we're explicitly told about, or what we explicitly vote about. Think about the pyramid earlier. You have your intellectuals, your second-hand dealers, your actuators, and in the actuators you can also throw in the media, your voting public, and then your politicians. You can call these your explicit beliefs. If you polled somebody on their explicit beliefs, they're going to tell you whatever is going to be reflected in their vote most of the time. These explicit beliefs center around an idea that ideas are the primary things that influence people over time. You know, Karl Marx has had a strong influence in the world, for better or worse. Friedrich Hayek has had a strong influence. Milton Friedman, Jesus Christ, Mahatma Gandhi have all had strong influences. And these ideas that they propagated and the center philosophy, the philosophies through which these ideas are filtered, have had large influences. People explicitly call themselves certain things following this. People call themselves Christians. People call themselves Hayekians. People call themselves Marxists or Marxians or communists. But I think there's another way that we can look at this. There's another set of beliefs that influence the way that we view the world. And it's not necessarily the way that we are polled or the way that we tell you we believe something, but it's the way that we act. And I call these implicit beliefs. Take the pyramid again, and these implicit beliefs are things that drive your experience. They are the things that influence the social institutions around you, the formal and informal institutions, down to, you know, what are the norms that govern your conversation? What are the norms that govern how you drive on the road? What are the things that you do with that little screen with a keyboard in your pocket? There are people who influence these as well. The very, very top, you have inventors. You can't have the Apple computer without Steve Wozniak. You can't have the light bulb without Thomas Edison. You can't have the airplane without the Wright brothers. You can't have steel without Bessemer. And then you have people who take these ideas, take these inventions, take these things that these people were able to bring into existence that they never before were able to find. Those are your entrepreneurs, your Henry Ford types, your Elon Musks, your Richard Bransons, your Peter Thiels, your Steve Jobs. And then people to get them out into society, much like the actuators on the former pyramid. These are going to be your venture capitalists, your investors, your funders. So again, Peter Thiel or Andreessen Horowitz's firm in San Francisco, many of the companies that they've invested in have probably impacted your life in one way or another. Who in here has heard of Uber? We've taken Uber or Lyft, ever done a ride-sharing service, or is familiar with Airbnb? These are companies that they've invested in, that they've been able to essentially bring into existence that formerly weren't there. And then there are consumers beneath them. The consumers take in the products that these people create. They take in the things that the inventors were invented, the entrepreneurs were able to turn into a business, something lucrative for people to follow. That rational utility maximization, the entrepreneurs were able to make it rational for people to view that as a way that they can maximize their utility. And then the venture capitalists were able to propagate it further throughout society. It comes together in this way that we can think of actions before that kind of we were losing with the former pyramid. Yes, we have explicit beliefs, and these explicit beliefs are important. They influence how people are polled, they influence how people vote, they influence the outcome of referenda, they influence the outcome of elections. And these are very important, but I think that they sincerely overlook and underplay the importance of the implicit beliefs that people have, the experiences that they have throughout the day. The role that these inventors, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and consumers play in creating action, in creating social change, in creating a different kind of world. Your ideas and experiences, your explicit and implicit beliefs change the way that the world works. So, we can think of a couple case studies, right? So one of my favorite case studies in this matter is that of the taxi industry. The taxi industry, up until recently, and very much so recently, is an incredibly difficult industry to get into. Why, you might ask? You're essentially just putting a sign on your car and saying that you drive people around for a certain price. It has many great social benefits. being able to drive people home after they've had too much to drink for the night is a great way of actually decreasing the number of drunk driving incidents out there. But until recently, to get a taxi medallion, essentially the certificate for you to drive a car around New York City and call yourself a taxi driver, it would cost you upwards of $250,000 just to get that medallion. It's a little piece of metal that goes on the very front of the hood of the car. So each of those cars out there, $250,000 just to get them on the road. And that doesn't take into consideration all the hours you have to spend sitting in the taxi bureau, all the hours you have to spend trying to find someone to let you drive their car, all the hours you have to spend to apply to become a taxi driver somewhere. And there's a serious issue here. You'll stand on the streets of New York City and you'll find that it's difficult to get a cab sometimes. The supply is not meeting demand. So there are a couple ways that we can fix this issue, right? And we can go out there, form a pyramid, and we can write lots of white papers. We can tell people, like, these are economically inefficient. These policies create economic deadweight loss, and they make the world worse off. They make it harder for people to get taxis. They make it harder for somebody who wants to become a taxi driver to support their families. And they generally make the world a worse off place. That's one way that we can approach it. And trust me, people have actually tried this for many, many years. If you go on Google Scholar and search taxi regulation, a half of a tenth of a second, 41,000 results come up. Most of those results are before the year 2010. So that's one way we can approach it, and you can see this at different levels of the pyramid, right? So you don't necessarily have to be in the think tank or actuator level of the pyramid. You can be out on the street convincing people, hey, look, taxi regulations are inefficient. The taxi cartels make the world worse off. They're negatively impacting your life. You can send all these letters out to your representatives. You can go get grandma out there to call her representative and tell them, you know, I don't like these taxi regulations. Are you going to vote against them? But when push comes to shove, most of those people on the street aren't going to change their behavior. They aren't going to seriously give up their time and money on that one issue. So you're probably going to be today, especially when you have the taxi industry out there throwing in $500,000 just to city regulators, telling them, hey, you need to keep these because you can't have other people driving cars. There are going to be serious problems if you have other people driving cars. If you get more people out there, more taxi drivers on the street, you can't have that. So you run into what we had before, which is this issue of public choice. Or you can invent a different experience. You can make it better. You can create a better system that is cheaper, that people prefer, without them having to change their explicit beliefs. Most people who ride using Uber, Lyft, or Sidecar, I don't think that if you ask them for their opinions on taxi regulations, that they would have some very strong opinion to give you that was very well versed in economics. They might tell you when they think about it, oh yeah, that sounds pretty dumb because they're in an Uber, a Lyft, or a Sidecar. But at the end of the day, they don't use those systems. They don't use those apps because they see taxi regulations as inefficient. If anybody isn't familiar with what Uber or Lyft are, they're ride-sharing services where you go on your phone, you can find them, and somebody who doesn't have a taxi license can show up and pick you up. And it's cheaper than a cab. I would venture to say it's safer than a cab. And it's seriously throwing a wrench into the taxi industry, which has formerly used a lot of money and a lot of time to regulate them out of existence, regulate its competitors out of existence. You don't have to go out there and change people's explicit beliefs. Create a better experience for them. If anybody watches South Park, there was actually an episode recently, about a month ago, where the handy car, where one of the characters drives around and ticks off the taxi industry in South Park. The taxi industry eventually gets together, and it's this little backwards Colorado town, so there's like 4 of them, and they're all very shady characters. But they get together and they're conspiring how they can undermine the sidecar ride-sharing, the handy car ride-sharing service. And one of the main characters in the back of the room says, well, why don't you just, create a better service for people, make your prices a little cheaper and are friendlier to people, and then people will just naturally choose your service. And one of his friends hits him and says, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So that's exactly what Uber and Lyft and Sidecar do. They create a better experience for people. And they're not the only ones, right? We can think of a bunch of different ideas out there. So Airbnb is a home sharing service, essentially. So you can put your apartment up on Airbnb and people can rent it from you while you're out of town. And this has thrown a serious wrench into the hotel industry's cartel that they formerly had. In many cities, like New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, the hotel industry is very, very upset because more and more people are going on Airbnb, finding cheaper, cleaner, friendlier options than going to a hotel. It was $200, $300, $400 a night. Tesla Motors is a great example on a couple of accounts. So Tesla creates high-end electric cars, and they've actually started moving into the high-end sedan market. And they make nice electric cars, not like a Chevy Volt or something like that, something that works really well over time. And not only are they very good at creating electric cars, something that other companies have tried for many, many years to do, they're very good at creating batteries now too. So they've been able to nearly perfect, thus far, green energy, something that before was very much not an industry we want to go into without major government subsidies. Tesla, for example, is rolling out a battery pack later at the end of this year that can actually power a one-family home. So you can take your home completely off the grid on this battery pack that they're creating. And they are one company that, at the height of the green tech bubble that was around in 2006, 2007, 2008, they survived that bubble. They survived before the cylinder crisis came out, before it was discovered that all these companies were essentially bundles that nobody would actually want to go into. SpaceX is another company run by the co-founder and CEO of Tesla, Elon Musk. SpaceX has essentially privatized space exploration thus far. They've been able to take projects that were formerly done by NASA, launching satellites into space, launching different deliveries to the International Space Station up, something that's incredibly complex and normally requires around 500,000 employees across the United States. NASA employs about 500,000 employees across the United States. SpaceX employs about 3,000, all in Southern California. They've been able to take something that before, if you talk to most people about privatizing NASA, that's something that people actually feel very strongly about. If you ask them, like, well, do you think that we should privatize the space exploration industry? They'll react much more strongly against you than if you ask them about, privatizing all schools or something like that. People feel very strongly about this. So if you can create a product out there that is just as good, if not better, than the competitor, the status quo competitor, people don't blink. SpaceX is actually trying now, cool side tangent, to land rockets at sea. So usually rockets have to be recovered at sea by like a diving squad or something, or they burn up in the atmosphere. But they want to create reusable rockets that can actually land vertically on platforms in the middle of the ocean. Another great example is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a really good example. Who here isn't familiar with what Bitcoin is? Okay. So what Bitcoin is it's an online digital currency. And it's a completely decentralized digital currency. And arguably, you can make arguments about whether or not it's a currency or a commodity, because the price fluctuates quite rapidly. But the important thing behind Bitcoin is the technology that makes it work. It's not found in any one place online. It's not at any one computer, any one set of servers. It's distributed among every single computer that uses it. It's completely anonymous and it's completely peer-to-peer. So it uses a system called the blockchain, which is like this totally public ledger that every transaction is recorded in. For a while, it came out in like the late 2000s. I had several people come to me and say like, oh, you need to buy this. You can buy it for like 4 or 5 cents each. Buy 100. It'll be worth a lot someday. And I laughed at them because it's like, it's your funny online money. And then around this time last year, it was at about $1,200 per Bitcoin. So I know people who bought like 300 of those and were able to cash out with like hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the neat thing about Bitcoin is it's able to actually challenge this notion that we need to have a central arbiter for money. Some people go into like very basic ideas of a market economy is that you should probably have something similar to banks, especially a central bank. And it challenges not only the notion that you need a central bank, but you even need currency issuing banks at all. And there's a lot of cool technology that can come out with the blockchain. So there are all these examples of how we can change the world through actually just creating the experiences for people. We can act as the inventors, we can act as the entrepreneurs, the venture capitalists, but what do we actually do about it, right? If you actually care about social change, you're probably wondering, okay, cool, I can be the next Steve Jobs, but I have just as much chance, if not better, of actually becoming the next president. I think that at the very least, what we need is we need a shift of vision. We need a broad cultural shift, and culture is this very complex, tricky issue. We call it spontaneous order, where everybody reinforces it, but nobody designs culture. So your actions, your beliefs, your experiences are all things that reinforce culture. So at the very least, we need a shift of vision. There's this vision that we have currently in the United States, and I pull a lot of this from a phenomenal book recently by Peter Thiel. He's the co-founder of PayPal, one of the ancestors of Facebook. His book is 0 to 1. I normally hate business books. It's very, very, very good. He talks at the end of it, societies can have a definite or indefinite vision of the future, and an optimistic or pessimistic vision of the future. The neat thing about American culture, generally speaking, is it's always been pretty optimistic. We've always been a country to go out and have individuals who are willing to build new things, to make the world a brighter, cooler place. Think of the Gilded Era, where we had all these people like Rockefeller, Mellon, Fox, Carnegie. Think of even the first Silicon Valley tech boom. You had Bill Gates, you had Steve Jobs, you had Steve Wozniak, you had Peter Thiel. All these people out there creating new things. But there's this tricky, he calls that definite optimism, right? To go back to the idea of like the flying cars in the year 2000. We see the future, it's going to be better, and we're going to make it better. We have a plan to make it better. But there's this tricky switch in like the 1970s, 1980s, especially as the U.S. labor market started moving more towards things like the financial industry, that people wanted a more liquid future. If you go into working in finances, you kind of like the idea of liquidity, like the idea that you have a totally open future. And culture followed something like this. So we moved towards what he calls indefinite optimism. The world's going to get better, but we don't really know how. Can you imagine what the world's going to look like in 50 years? Does anybody have like a really concrete vision of how they think the world is actually going to be? You might have an idea here and there about how computers might be working, how cars might be working at that time, but nobody has like these kind of really cool utopian, almost sci-fi visions that we had up until probably the 1960s, 1970s in the United States. We've shifted to what he calls indefinite optimism. What we need is definite optimism. We need to go back to the culture of innovation and entrepreneurship that for many, many, many years the United States as a culture had. We need to go from innovations that are increments to innovations that are leaps. Think of any major innovation that has come out in the last 20 years. Something that's totally paradigm shifting. I would argue the best thing you could probably come up with would be something like smartphones, innovations in communication. But those are probably where most of our innovations have come from. We haven't had any major innovations in travel, for example. For about an entire century, a couple of centuries, up until the mid-1900s, we had tons of innovations in travel. We had a steam engine, we had a steamboat, we had trains, we had different kinds of trains, we had cars come out, we had mass production, which allowed for more people to own cars, we had flight come out, we had the jet engine was invented, and then nothing for about 50 years. We need to go back to the idea of leaps. So, at least culturally, we need to view the vision as, the vision of the future as something that can be won and will be won. This is a matrix that he has in the book that I think is really illustrative. If you think of a current culture that is indefinite pessimist, to give you an idea, you think of most of Europe. Europe's a total mess. You read any article about what it's like, especially in like Southern Europe, and like Spain, Italy, or Greece. And there's very much this, let's die now for tomorrow we die culture there. Even in Germany, you can get like 10 weeks off every year of paid vacation. And an idea of a definite pessimist future would be the Chinese. The Chinese, we tend to think that they're scary and that they're creating something that we will never be able to fight, but they're actually just replicating everything that we've done. Most of the innovations that come out of China aren't actually innovations. They're usually just ways of doing things bigger and faster, and things that we've already done. So just building cities bigger. They've actually built scale replicas, like totally to scale of like Manhattan, and then just abandoned the whole town. So imagine like New York City completely abandoned. Because the Chinese know that there's something coming and that they need to get up to where the West is. They know that the world is getting scarier and that the world is getting worse and they need to get there. And then, like I said, the definite optimist vision of the United States. So, on a cultural, on a big picture, okay, that's what we can do. But on an individual level, how do we actually go build this? Most people statistically are going to fail even when they try it. So what is, if there is an art or a science to entrepreneurship, what is it? And I like the idea that entrepreneurship is the process of discovering and propagating secrets. Think of any good entrepreneurial venture. It is something that somebody was able to find, that nobody else saw, and was able to bring into reality, and was able to get more and more people to sign up. In his book, Teal notes that the good startup is essentially a cult, because people who are members of a good startup believe a secret that nobody else believes, but they want to get it out there into the world. And that's essentially what cults do. Cults are people who they believe a certain metaphysical way of the world being that way, and they want to get it out there. So we need to find secrets and propagate those. And if there was any easy way of finding secrets, they wouldn't be secrets. But you can at least cultivate a certain individual mindset, right? And that individual mindset is one of contrarianism. It's one of thinking for yourself. Not necessarily being fed the status quo that you're used to coming into. Contrarianism can mean a couple things. It's usually like a corporate buzzword, like, oh, we're a contrarian company, which is usually just a way for board members, for CEOs to justify to their board that they weren't able to meet their expectations this quarter. But contrarianism is, at the very least, the idea of thinking for yourself. This doesn't mean going against the crowd just to go against the crowd. This means looking for solutions to problems where nobody else is looking for solutions. Or even seeing problems nobody else even sees as problems. Again, think of the article from the New York Times in 1985. Nobody was going to want to have a keyboard at their fingertips when they go to the beach. No one wants to have a laptop in every attaché case. And then today, if you're a business person, you don't have a laptop on you or an iPad or at least your iPhone, then you're going to be seriously disconnected from the rest of the world. The people who were able to propagate laptops saw a problem that wasn't being filled and found a way to fill that problem. But like I said, secrets are really hard to come across. If all the secrets of the world were solved, we wouldn't have any new innovation. Anytime we get a new innovation, that's a sign that there's a secret that has been unsolved. Think of any of the things I had on a couple slides ago. Airbnb, Uber, Lyft sidecar, the blockchain with Bitcoin, Tesla Motors, SpaceX. They all found secrets, better ways of doing things. And these secrets were solutions to problems nobody else had thought of. So there is no easy solution to it. But my challenge to you is just go start finding secrets. Start thinking of ways that you can make the world a better place and bring those into reality. And just do it. At any given point, if you're the one doing it, nobody else is, you're the one who's discovered that secret. And that's the cool thing about it. So like, for us with Praxis, we believe in a secret. We believe in a very strong secret, and that's the secret that the traditional educational path or schooling path for most people is not actually the way that people need to become successful. How do they define successful? So we say, regardless of what you want, you don't necessarily need college, for example, or you don't need graduate school. You don't need to go to that big corporate job that did the on-campus recruiting because they're the ones who did on-campus recruiting. You're worth, or one of our slogans is, you're worth more than college. And that doesn't mean don't go to college, but that might mean you're worth more than just a college degree defining the way that you shape your life. And this is a highly contrarian idea among many audiences. I once gave a talk similar to this to a high school business conference, and for about a week afterwards, I was getting very angry phone calls from high school teachers. Very nice comments from the students, but very angry phone calls from teachers. But that's the kind of secret that we believe. And any member of our team believes it strongly. And to the point that you could mistake it for a cult. Teal talks in 0 to 1, for example, about how there is a uniform of a good startup, right? And the uniform is anything that has the startup's logo on it. right? You go to Silicon Valley. I was in San Francisco a couple weeks ago. I'm not a huge fan of Silicon Valley for like cultural purposes, but I was in San Francisco a couple weeks ago, and like every single member of a startup who was there, even if they weren't there to work, had their company logo on a t-shirt and jeans, that was it. And that's because they believe in the idea so strongly they're willing to advertise it on themselves without even thinking about it. So my challenge to you is, this is taken totally out of context, it could be a fun quote, but start a cult. Discover the secrets of the world and actually try to pursue those. And maybe you change people's experiences. And if you change those experiences and somebody else is working on changing their beliefs or changing their ideas, then you can change the world.